I used to believe that if you trained hard enough, if you followed orders, and if you trusted the men beside you, there was nothing in this world that could truly reach you. But during the late summer of 1935, I learned that some things do not need chaos or darkness to break you. They only need time, patience, and the certainty that you will eventually realize you are no longer alone, even when every man in your unit is standing awake and armed. You should understand before this goes any further that I am not speaking to you as a storyteller looking for attention. I am speaking to you as someone who survived something that was never meant to be survived, something that did not ambush us, did not rush us, and did not reveal itself in any way that would have made sense to trained soldiers. Because whatever followed us through that forest was not interested in speed or violence at first. It was interested in observation, in proximity, and in learning how we moved when we thought no one was watching. Before I tell you what happened next, do something for me. Subscribe to this channel, leave a like so these stories continue to surface, and comment where you are listening from, because this community just passed 1,000 subscribers. And that tells me there are still people willing to sit with uncomfortable truths instead of turning away. And if you stay with me until the end of this story, I promise you that the way you think about forests, silence, and familiar voices will never be the same again. My name is James Barlow. I was a private assigned to an armed detachment, sent to secure a remote forest corridor that year. And by the second week, we stopped measuring time by days and started measuring it by how often we heard something moving just beyond the tree line without ever seeing it, because something out there had begun to mirror our patrol routes, our pauses, and eventually the sound of our own voices. When the final report was written and the surviving men were questioned separately, every one of us used the same words without being prompted, without hearing the other speak, and without hesitation. Because by then there was no doubt left in any of our minds that we had not been followed by an animal, a hostile force, or another unit, but hunted deliberately by something we could only describe as a Wendigo. The forest we were sent into did not look hostile at first, and that was the first mistake we made, because hostility announces itself through broken branches, sudden silence, or whether that turns without warning. While this place welcomed us with warmth, with insects buzzing lazily through the air, and with sunlight filtering down through leaves so thick they formed a ceiling that seemed almost intentional, as if the woods wanted us to feel comfortable before it decided how close it could let us get. Our detachment consisted of 8 men, all armed, all trained, and all convinced that whatever assignment command had quietly redirected us toward was nothing more than another precautionary sweep through territory that had recently gone quiet. And I remember the sound of Corporal Nathaniel Rourke laughing as we unloaded supplies from the transport truck, because there is a particular kind of laughter that only exists when men are certain there is nothing left to worry about. The first few days passed without incident, and by incident I mean anything we could have reported with confidence, because there were no signs of enemy movement, no gunshots in the distance, and no disturbances we could mark on a map, only the gradual realization that the forest did not behave the way forests usually do when armed men move through them, since the insects never scattered when we approached, and the birds did not lift into the air, as if whatever governed those reactions had already decided our presence was expected. It was on the 4th night that we heard the footsteps for the first time. And even now I struggle to explain how something so simple could have unsettled us so deeply, because the sound itself was ordinary, measured and unhurried, and that was precisely the problem, since nothing in the woods walks with the cadence of a man unless it has learned to do so deliberately. We froze, rifles raised, scanning the tree line, while Sergeant William Harker whispered orders under his breath, and when the sound stopped as suddenly as it had begun, we convinced ourselves that exhaustion had sharpened our nerves too far, because that is what trained soldiers do when faced with uncertainty that does not yet justify fear. By morning, we found tracks near the perimeter, but they were wrong in a way that did not immediately register, because they were spaced like human steps, but pressed too deeply into the soil, as if whatever made them had leaned forward while walking, placing its weight in a way that suggested intent rather than motion. Lieutenant Arthur Keene ordered the area logged and dismissed the matter without comment. Yet that night, the footsteps returned, closer this time, circling the camp with patience that felt rehearsed. And when Private Thomas Ives muttered my name from across the fire, I turned toward him instinctively, only to realize his lips had not moved at all. That was the moment I understood that whatever followed us was not waiting to strike, because it had already begun to learn. By the end of the first week, we had stopped pretending the sounds were natural, though no one spoke the truth aloud, because once a thing is named, it becomes real. And real things demand action that can no longer be postponed. So instead, we focused on routines, patrols, and maintaining the illusion of order, while something unseen tested how long that illusion could hold. The forest grew louder at night, not with chaos but with repetition, as if every sound we made was being returned to us with slight variations. Our boots echoed back a fraction of a second too late. Our whispered exchanges came back softened and warped, and once, unmistakably, I heard Sergeant Harker clear his throat from somewhere deep in the trees while he sat directly beside me staring into the fire. Sleep became a negotiation rather than a necessity, because whenever one man closed his eyes, another swore he heard movement, and the idea that something could approach armed soldiers without fear slowly eroded the confidence we had been trained to rely on, replacing it with a kind of shared tension that vibrated through the camp like a wire pulled too tight. On the 9th night, Corporal Rourke disappeared, and the absence he left behind was worse than any evidence, because there were no signs of struggle, no scattered gear, and no blood, only his rifle resting neatly against a tree at the edge of the clearing, as if it had been placed there deliberately for us to find, a gesture that felt less like violence and more like instruction. We searched until dawn, calling his name despite knowing better, and when the forest answered back with voices that almost sounded like ours, Lieutenant Keene ordered silence, though by then the damage had been done, because something had learned how to speak without speaking, how to summon without revealing itself. That afternoon, we found markings carved into the bark of several trees surrounding the camp, symbols that did not resemble known languages yet repeated with unsettling consistency. And when Private Ives traced one with his fingers, he began to cry without understanding why, as if his body recognized something his mind refused to accept. It was then that Sergeant Harker said the word no one else wanted to speak, and when he did, the forest seemed to lean inward, listening, because the name Wendigo carries weight that does not belong to myth alone, but to the idea of hunger that outlives reason and patience, that outlasts resistance. That night, the footsteps entered the camp itself, moving between our tents with careful precision, and when I felt breath against my ear, I did not turn, because instinct told me that whatever stood behind me wanted to be acknowledged more than it wanted to attack. By morning, 2 more men were gone, and the remaining 5 of us swore, separately and without hesitation, that we were no longer guarding the forest, but being contained by it, watched by something that understood us far better than we understood it, and that realization settled over us like a verdict we could no longer appeal. After Corporal Rourke and the others vanished, the structure of our unit did not collapse all at once, but began to deform slowly, like wood bending under heat rather than snapping, because discipline can survive fear for a time, yet it cannot survive the steady realization that rules no longer apply to whatever is observing you from just beyond the edge of sight. Lieutenant Keene ordered a perimeter expansion at first light, convinced that movement would restore control, and we obeyed without question because obedience was easier than acknowledging that the forest now felt arranged around us rather than occupied by us, as if paths we had walked the day before no longer led where memory insisted they should. As we moved deeper between the trees, the air grew thick and unmoving, carrying the smell of damp earth and something older beneath it, something sour and faintly metallic, and I became aware that the sounds of our movement were no longer echoing naturally, but arriving back to us with a delay that suggested intention, as though whatever followed us was deciding which noises to return and which to keep. Private Thomas Ives was the first to break formation, not by running or shouting, but by stopping entirely, his boots rooted to the ground while his eyes tracked something none of us could see. And when Sergeant Harker grabbed his shoulder to pull him back into line, Ives whispered that someone was standing just behind the trees using Lieutenant Keen's voice, speaking softly and patiently, repeating his name, the way a man does when he expects obedience. We forced him forward, rifles raised, hearts pounding, and when no one appeared, we told ourselves that exhaustion and grief had finally taken their toll. Yet the certainty in Ives's expression lingered with me far longer than the silence that followed, because it was the look of someone who had been recognized. By the time we returned to camp, the light had shifted, stretching shadows across the clearing in ways that made distances difficult to judge, and it was then that we noticed new markings carved into the ground itself, shallow grooves circling our tents in a pattern too precise to be accidental, forming a boundary that none of us remembered creating. That night, the Wendigo revealed another layer of its patience. Because instead of approaching us directly, it mimicked the sounds of our routines, the click of a safety being released, the scrape of a boot against stone, the low murmur of conversation just beyond the firelight. And every imitation carried a subtle flaw that made it worse than silence, because it forced our minds to fill in what did not belong. Sleep became impossible, not because of noise but because of anticipation, and when I finally closed my eyes, I dreamed of standing guard while something walked behind me, matching my pace perfectly, close enough that I could feel its breath, but never close enough to justify turning around. By dawn, Private Ives was gone, and this time there was evidence. Not blood or struggle, but his uniform folded neatly at the edge of the clearing, buttons fastened, boots placed side by side, as if the forest itself had undressed him with care. The loss of Private Ives shattered whatever restraint Lieutenant Keen had been maintaining, because authority relies on belief as much as rank, and once belief fractures, it does not return intact. So his orders grew sharper, faster, and less considered, driven by the need to reclaim control rather than by strategy. We were down to 4 men now, and the forest seemed to accommodate that number effortlessly, shrinking our sense of space until the clearing felt too large when we stood together and too small when any one of us stepped away, a contradiction that left us constantly aware of absence, even in each other's presence. Sergeant Harker suggested we abandon the camp and move south at first light, and though no one argued openly, I sensed the unspoken fear that movement would only amuse whatever had learned our patterns so thoroughly, because it had already proven that distance meant nothing to it, and familiarity meant everything. Before we could act, the Wendigo tested us again, this time with proximity so intimate it bordered on violation, because as we prepared to move, we heard breathing directly behind us, slow and controlled, matching the rhythm of a man at rest. And when we spun with rifles raised, there was nothing there except the lingering impression that we had interrupted something private. That was when Lieutenant Keen began to speak aloud, not to us, but to the forest, issuing commands as if authority itself could compel a response. And the moment he finished, something answered from multiple directions at once, repeating his words back in perfect cadence, stripping them of command and leaving only sound. The effect was immediate and devastating, because power spoken without obedience becomes mockery, and I watched as Kane's certainty drained away, replaced by a hollow focus that suggested he had begun to understand we were no longer participants in this encounter, but specimens. As night fell, the forest grew still in a way that felt deliberate rather than natural, and I realized with a sinking clarity that silence had become another tool, one that forced us to supply our own dread. And when the Wendigo finally moved, it did so openly, stepping just close enough to be seen without revealing its full shape, a tall presence between the trees that bent slightly forward as if listening. I cannot describe its form with certainty, only the way its presence altered the air, compressing it until breathing felt like effort, and the way its attention settled on us not as prey, but as something familiar, something it had been waiting to claim. That night, Lieutenant Keen walked into the trees without speaking, his rifle left behind, his expression calm in a way that terrified me more than panic ever could. And we did not follow, because by then we understood that pursuit was exactly what the Wendigo wanted. By morning, only 3 of us remained, and the forest no longer hid its interest, because whatever hunted us had grown confident enough to let us know that the end would not come suddenly, but patiently, one name at a time. By the time Lieutenant Keene vanished into the trees, the idea of survival had already shifted in my mind from something active to something conditional, because it became clear that remaining alive depended less on skill or caution and more on whether whatever hunted us still found value in keeping us where we were. The 3 of us left were Sergeant William Harker, Private Samuel Rowe, and myself, and though none of us said it aloud, we all understood that the forest had begun to thin us deliberately, not out of urgency, but preference, as if certain behaviors or reactions disqualified a man from continuing, while others invited closer attention. Harker insisted we destroy the camp before moving, not out of regulation but instinct, because the thought of leaving behind something recognizable felt like surrender. And as we dismantled tents and scattered supplies, I noticed how quiet the forest had become. Not the natural quiet of early morning, but a held silence, the kind that suggests anticipation rather than absence. When we finally moved south, following a route we had mapped weeks earlier, the terrain resisted us in subtle ways: fallen branches where none had been before, shallow ravines that forced us to detour, and trees that seemed closer together than memory allowed. And with each adjustment we made, I felt the creeping certainty that the forest was not blocking us, but redirecting us. Rowe began speaking less as the day wore on, his responses delayed, his eyes tracking movement that never resolved into shape. And when I asked him what he was seeing, he answered honestly that it looked like men standing still, facing away, positioned just far enough apart to suggest patrol spacing. We halted near dusk, exhaustion overriding fear, and as we prepared to rest without fire or sound, the Wendigo resumed its work, not through imitation this time, but through absence, because the noises that should have existed did not return, and the void they left behind pressed inward until my own breathing felt intrusive. That night I woke to the sensation of being watched from above, not from the trees but from the darkness itself. And when I shifted slightly, the pressure remained, as though whatever observed us did not require a fixed position, only awareness. And I understood then that it had not been following us in the traditional sense, but occupying the space around us, filling it slowly until escape became a concept rather than an option. Just before dawn, Rowe stood without warning and walked a few steps away, his movements calm and deliberate, and when Harker whispered for him to stop, Rowe turned with an expression of profound relief and said that it was over now, that he finally understood what it wanted, and before either of us could move, he stepped into the trees and vanished without sound. We did not search for him, not because we lacked courage, but because we lacked illusion. And when the forest answered our silence with nothing at all, I realized that the Wendigo had learned which moments required spectacle and which demanded restraint. After Rowe disappeared, Sergeant Harker and I continued south without speaking, our movements stripped down to necessity, because language had become dangerous, a thing that could be taken, reshaped, and returned with intent, and every word spoken felt like an offering we could not afford to make. The forest changed as we moved, not in appearance but in behavior, because distances stretched unnaturally, hours passed without measurable progress, and landmarks repeated in ways that made memory unreliable. And I began to suspect that the Wendigo did not need to trap us physically, because it was eroding our sense of sequence, making it impossible to know whether we were moving forward or simply being allowed to believe we were. Harker slowed noticeably as the day wore on, his breath shallow, his focus fractured, and when I asked him if he was injured, he shook his head and told me quietly that something had been walking beside him for hours, not visible, not audible, but present in the way pressure exists before a storm, and that it had begun to adjust its pace to match his. We stopped near a dry creek bed to rest, and as we sat in silence, Harker admitted what neither of us wanted to say, that the Wendigo was no longer testing us, no longer observing, but preparing, because it had gathered enough information to decide how this would end. As night fell, the forest finally revealed what patience had been building toward, because for the first time we heard it move without disguise, its steps heavy yet controlled, circling us with purpose. And though I never saw its full shape, I sensed height where height did not belong, mass distributed in a way that suggested something that had learned to stand as men do without ever being one. Harker raised his rifle and shouted, not in command but defiance, and the sound of his voice broke something fragile in the air, because the Wendigo answered immediately, speaking his words back with perfect clarity, stripping them of force and leaving only the sound of fear exposed. In that moment I understood that the creature did not hunt bodies first, but certainty, because once belief in outcome collapses, resistance becomes irrelevant. And when Harker lowered his weapon and stepped forward, his face blank and peaceful, I knew he had already been claimed. I did not follow him into the trees, not because I was stronger or wiser, but because whatever governed the Wendigo's attention had shifted elsewhere, and as I remained behind alone, surrounded by silence that felt earned rather than accidental, I realized that survival was not a victory, but a delay granted for reasons I would never fully understand. By morning, I was the only one left, and the forest had grown indifferent, as if its purpose had been fulfilled, and though I eventually found my way out, carrying nothing but memory and report, I knew with certainty that whatever hunted us had not lost interest in humanity, only patience. I walked out of that forest with the kind of calm that only arrives when your mind cannot afford to fully process what it has witnessed, because if it lets the truth in all at once, it will collapse. And at that point, collapse would have meant lying down between the trees and allowing the wilderness to claim me, the way it claimed the others. So I kept moving with an empty focus, stepping over roots and through brush as if I were still on patrol, as if the mission could still be completed if I just reached the road. When I finally saw the break in the trees and the thin ribbon of dirt track beyond it, I expected relief to hit me so hard it would make my knees buckle. Yet what I felt instead was a tight caution, because the silence behind me did not feel like absence. It felt like a hand letting go only because it had decided the grip was no longer necessary. I reached the road sometime after midday, dehydrated, filthy, shaking with exhaustion that I had ignored for days, and when a truck finally came rattling toward me, the driver slowed and stared as though he was seeing something he had no category for, and when he asked where the others were, I opened my mouth to answer and found that my throat locked, not because I did not want to speak, but because I suddenly understood that language was part of the trap, and that once I began to describe what happened, I would be giving it shape that it could use. I told him only that my unit was missing and that I needed to be taken to the nearest station, and he nodded with the kind of cautious sympathy men reserve for those who look touched by something they do not understand. And during the ride, I kept watching the tree line slide past, waiting for movement, waiting for any sign that what hunted us had followed me beyond its territory. And what frightened me most was that nothing happened at all. At the station, officers gave me water and asked questions I could not answer cleanly, because every detail felt both vital and impossible. And when they brought out a typewriter and told me to state my name, rank, and the purpose of our detachment, I did what soldiers do when they want to survive an interrogation, which is to cling to procedure. So I gave them the facts, I gave them dates, I gave them coordinates. I listed Corporal Rourke, Private Ives, Lieutenant Keene, Private Rowe, and I watched their faces tighten as the roll of missing men grew longer. When they asked what happened, I tried to describe the footsteps, the voices, the folded uniform, and the way the forest seemed to rearrange itself around us. And I saw skepticism, but the kind that protects a person from stepping into a reality they cannot control. So I tightened my jaw and told them that trained armed soldiers had been hunted, and that every surviving man had said the same word without being prompted. And that word was Wendigo. They went quiet at that, because even men who laugh at superstition have heard certain names spoken with caution. And a young clerk stopped typing and looked at me as if I had broken the rules of what could be officially recorded. And I realized then that my report was not just a story, but a threat to order, because it suggested that training and weapons were not guarantees, only comforts we carry until something decides to strip them away. That night they put me in a small room with a cot, and I lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the building settle, trying to convince myself that walls and lamps and voices in a hallway meant I had returned to the human world, until just after midnight I heard it, faint and patient, the sound of boots walking somewhere outside the station, paced like a man on duty, stopping, resuming, and stopping again, as if someone were taking a slow lap to learn the shape of the place. I did not sit up when I heard those steps, because the first lesson the forest taught me was that reaction can be an invitation. And though my skin prickled and my heart hammered as if it were trying to break free, I forced my breathing to stay measured, because if I allowed panic to take over, I would be giving whatever was outside exactly what it wanted, which was proof that it had reached me even here. The steps moved along the building, pausing near a window, and though I could not see the glass from where I lay, I could feel the attention settle on the room, the way you can feel someone staring without looking at them. And the air thickened with a pressure that reminded me of those nights in the camp when the forest went quiet and our own presence felt too loud, and I realized with cold clarity that I had not brought it out of the woods. I had simply carried the memory of it, and memory was enough to reopen the door. In the early hours, a deputy unlocked the door and told me I had visitors, and the fact that the word visitors could exist in this situation struck me as absurd, because nothing about that mission should have produced visitors. Yet when I was led into a small office, I found two men in plain clothes waiting, their faces careful, their posture rigid in the way of people who believe they are here to contain a problem rather than listen to a person. The older one introduced himself as Dr. Malcolm Sutter and spoke with a calm authority that suggested he had handled broken men before, and he asked me to repeat the story from the beginning. Not the official elements, but the sensations, the timing, the specific moments when fear began to override training. And I answered because I had no alternative, and because a part of me wanted someone else to hold this knowledge with me, so it would not rot inside my skull. As I spoke, he did not interrupt, yet I noticed that every time I described the voice mimicry, or the way the forest seemed to redirect us, his eyes narrowed as if he were recognizing a pattern rather than evaluating a claim. And when I reached the moment where Lieutenant Keene walked into the trees with a calm expression, Dr. Sutter asked a question that made my stomach drop, because he asked whether any of us had reported dreams in the days before. Dreams of hunger, dreams of being called by name, dreams where the shape of a man stood just behind you as you walked. I told him yes, because I had dreamed of pacing with something at my back, and Sergeant Harker had described pressure beside him that adjusted its pace, and Private Ives had cried while touching symbols that did not resemble language. And when I admitted those details, the younger man, whose name was Edwin Carver, shifted in his chair as if the room had suddenly become too small. Dr. Sutter told me carefully that there were older accounts, unofficial ones, filed under different names, in which armed groups returned diminished and altered, and that in every account the most consistent detail was not the creature's appearance, but its method, which involved imitation, patience, and the gradual erasure of trust between men. And he asked me whether I believed it was still out there, and I wanted to answer no, because no would have meant I could sleep again. But I could not lie to him, because lying felt like the first step toward becoming the kind of man who walks calmly into the trees. When the meeting ended, I was given papers to sign and instructions to remain available, and as I left the office, I saw a map pinned on the wall with several red marks scattered across regions that looked too familiar, and I understood that our unit had not been the first to swear they were hunted by a Wendigo, and that we would not be the last. And the knowledge did not make me feel special. It made me feel used, because it suggested someone had known enough to send us anyway. That night, as I sat alone again, I heard a voice in the hallway speak my name in Sergeant Harker's tone, soft and patient. And what shattered me was not that it sounded like him, but that it sounded like him trying to calm me, like him trying to make me step out of the room and follow. And in that moment, I understood that the hunt did not end when you leave the forest, because once it learns your voice, your fear, and your name, it can carry you anywhere you are willing to listen. The next morning, Dr. Sutter returned with a folder that looked older than it should have, the corners softened by use, and the paper inside carrying the faint smell of tobacco and dust. And when he placed it on the table between us, he did not say its title out loud at first, as if naming it might change the room. But I saw the typewritten line at the top and felt my stomach tighten, because it was the same sentence structure we had used in our own report. A date, a unit designation, and a claim that sounded unbelievable until you remembered that disbelief was the luxury of people who had never had their names spoken from the dark. Inside the folder were statements from men who had returned alone, men who described the same pacing steps, the same patient circling, the same voice mimicry that began as distant and ended as intimate. And the strangest part was that their accounts disagreed on what the creature looked like, with some insisting on antlered shapes and others describing something gaunt and almost human. Yet every account agreed on the way it behaved, because it did not rush, it did not rage, and it did not attack until the mind had already been softened enough to step forward on its own. Dr. Sutter told me he had been asked to consult because my report mirrored the older ones too closely, and when I demanded to know who had asked, he hesitated just long enough for me to understand that there were names above his pay and beyond my reach. And then he admitted that several agencies had quietly collected accounts over the years, not to publicize them but to map patterns, as if the Wendigo were a weather system that could be predicted if enough men disappeared in the right places. I leaned forward and asked him why our detachment had been sent at all if they already suspected what was out there. And he looked at me with a tired expression that told me he had asked the same question in his own head 1,000 times. And then he said something that cut deeper than any monster story, because he said that armed soldiers were sent precisely because armed soldiers were the only witnesses the world might believe, which meant the mission was never only to secure a corridor, but to produce a testimony strong enough to survive. Ridicule. The words settled in me like poison, because they reframed every night in the camp, every disappearance, every moment we held formation and pretended training would carry us through. And I realized with sick clarity that we had not been unlucky. We had been selected, and though no one had put a gun to our heads, the machinery that chose us had done something worse, because it had treated men like evidence. When I left the meeting room, I tried to keep my gaze forward, yet every corridor looked longer than it should have, and every door seemed slightly ajar. And I found myself listening for that soft repetition of my name, because after weeks of being hunted by sound, silence no longer felt safe. It felt like a held breath that could break at any moment. That evening, a storm rolled in, the first real weather I had seen since leaving the forest, and as rain hammered the roof and flooded the gutters, I sat by a window and watched the streetlights tremble in the wet darkness. And I told myself that even if the Wendigo existed, even if it could imitate and lure and erode, it could not belong here. It could not cross into town lights and telephone lines and human noise. And I repeated that thought like a prayer until I heard boots pacing outside again, slow and measured, as if someone were learning the rhythm of the station the way it had learned the rhythm of our camp. I did not move, and I did not look, and I tried to remember what Harker would have done. Yet memory betrayed me, because the voice that spoke next was not Harker's, and not Kane's, and not anyone I had heard in the forest, but my own voice, perfectly matched, speaking my name in a calm tone, as if it were only calling me to step outside for a routine check. And in that moment, I understood that it was no longer copying the dead, it was copying the living, which meant it had been closer to me than I had ever allowed myself to admit. The final statement I gave was not delivered with drama, because by then I had learned that the most terrifying truths do not arrive with music or warning. They arrive quietly, filed, stamped, and stored in cabinets that people assume contain nothing but paper. And when the officer placed the form in front of me and asked me to confirm that my account was accurate, I stared at the page and felt the weight of every word, because words were the only thing I had left, and I did not trust them anymore. I wrote my name, I wrote my rank, and I wrote that our detachment had been reduced to 1, and then I added a detail no one had asked for. Because if the file was going to exist at all, it needed one truth that cut through skepticism like a blade. So I wrote that the Wendigo did not win by force, but by familiarity, and that it did not need to kill a man to defeat him, because it could simply convince him to step forward. Dr. Sutter read what I wrote and did not correct it, and that silence was more confirming than any agreement, because it told me he had heard the same conclusion before. And when he walked me to the front entrance, he said, with careful gentleness, that I should go home, that routine might help, and that I should avoid isolation. And I wanted to laugh at the word home, because home implies safety, and safety had become an idea I no longer recognized. I traveled south by train, staring out at blurred tree lines and fields, and every time the cars passed a stretch of forest I felt my skin tighten, because the shape of trees against a dim sky had become a language I could not unread. And when night fell and passengers drifted into sleep, I stayed awake, listening, because after all that happened I could no longer accept sleep as normal. It felt like an invitation to be approached. In the early hours, somewhere between stations, the train slowed for a bend, and the wheels screamed faintly. And through the glass I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, motionless, too still to be human, and I told myself it was a trick of darkness and distance. Yet the moment I acknowledged it, the figure raised an arm slowly, not waving like a stranger, but lifting as if it were testing whether I would react. And the gesture was so patient and deliberate that my mouth went dry. I looked away and forced myself to breathe, and when I looked back the figure was gone, and the relief that should have followed did not come, because relief belongs to endings, and I had begun to understand that this did not end. It only relocated, as if the Wendigo were less a creature and more a pattern that could attach itself to a person like a shadow. When I reached my destination, I walked through familiar streets that felt newly staged, and every friendly voice sounded slightly wrong, not because it had been copied, but because my mind had been trained by terror to listen for flaws. And I realized then that even if the Wendigo never approached me again, it had already succeeded, because it had altered my relationship with sound, with trust, and with my own name. I tried to live quietly after that. I tried to work. I tried to eat. I tried to laugh at the right moments. But some nights I would wake to the softest pressure in the air, as if someone stood just outside my bedroom door, and I would hear my name spoken in a tone that matched my own tired voice, calm and convincing. And the worst part was that it never demanded, it only invited, because invitations require consent, and consent is the one thing a hunted man still believes he controls. The last time I heard it, I did not answer, and I did not move. And I repeated a single sentence in my head until dawn, because it was the only defense I had left, and that sentence was that whatever is out there can learn my voice, but it cannot have my will. And as the light finally crept into the room, I understood that survival is not escaping the forest. Survival is refusing to follow the voice that knows you best. If you made it this far, then you already understand why some reports were buried and why some survivors stopped speaking entirely. Because the Wendigo is not frightening because it is strong. It is frightening because it is patient, because it listens, and because it learns how to sound like certainty when you are starving for reassurance. Thank you for 1,000 subscribers. Truly, because that milestone tells me there are still people who want the real stories, the ones that leave a mark. And if you want more accounts like this, subscribe now, hit like, and comment the word Wendigo plus where you are watching from, because I read them all, and it helps this channel reach the people who cannot look away. And whatever you do after this video ends, when you hear your name somewhere it should not be, make sure the voice that answers is yours.